An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine by John Henry Newman. Chapter 6, Part 2. The Christian, being at first accounted a kind of Jew, was even on that score included in whatever odium and whatever bad associations attended the Jewish name. But in a little time his independence of the rejected people was clearly understood, as even the persecutions show, and he stood upon his own ground. Still his character did not change in the eyes of the world. For favor or for reproach, he was still associated with the votaries of secret and magical rites. The Emperor Hadrian, noted as he is for his inquisitive temper, and a partaker in so many mysteries, still believed that the Christians of Egypt allied themselves in the worship of Serapis. They are brought into connection with the magic of Egypt in the history of what is commonly called the Thundering Legion, so far as this, that the rain which relieved the emperor's army in the field, and which the Church ascribed to the prayers of the Christian soldiers, is by Dio Cassius attributed to an Egyptian magician who obtained it by invoking Mercury and other spirits. This war had been the occasion of one of the first recognitions which the state had conceded to the Oriental rites, though statesmen and emperors, as private men, had long taken part in them. The Emperor Marcus had been urged by his fears of the Marcomanni to resort to these foreign introductions, and is said to have employed Magi and Chaldeans in averting an unsuccessful issue of the war. It is observable that in the growing countenance which was extended to these rites in the 3rd century, Christianity came in for a share. The chapel of Alexander Severus contained statues of Abraham, Orpheus, Apollonius, Pythagoras, and our Lord. Here indeed, as in the case of Zenobia's Judaism, an eclectic philosophy aided the comprehension of religions. But immediately before Alexander, Heliogabalus, who was no philosopher, while he formally seated his Syrian idol in the Palatine, while he observed the mysteries of Cybele and Adonis, and celebrated his magic rites with human victims, intended also, according to Lampridius, to unite with his horrible superstition the Jewish and Samaritan religions and the Christian rite, that so the priesthood of Heliogabalus might comprise the mystery of every worship. Hence, more or less, the stories which occur in ecclesiastical history of the conversion or goodwill of the emperors to the Christian faith, of Hadrian, Mamaea, and others, besides Heliogabalus and Alexander. Such stories might often mean little more than that they favored it among other forms of Oriental superstition. What has been said is sufficient to bring before the mind an historical fact, which indeed does not need evidence. Upon the established religions of Europe, the East had renewed her encroachments, and was pouring forth a family of rites which in various ways attracted the attention of the luxurious, the political, the ignorant, the restless, and the remorseful. Armenian, Chaldee, Egyptian, Jew, Syrian, Phrygian, as the case might be, was the designation of the new Hierophant, and magic, superstition, barbarism, jugglery were the names given to his rite by the world. In this company appeared Christianity. When, then, 3 well-informed writers call Christianity a superstition and a magical superstition, they were not using words at random or the language of abuse, but they were describing it in distinct and recognized terms as cognate to those gloomy, secret, odious, disreputable religions which were making so much disturbance up and down the empire. The impression made on the world by circumstances immediately before the rise of Christianity received a sort of confirmation upon its rise in the appearance of the Gnostic and kindred heresies which issued from the Church during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Their resemblance in ritual and constitution to the Oriental religions, sometimes their historical relationship, is undeniable. And certainly it is a singular coincidence that Christianity should be first called a magical superstition by Suetonius, and then should be found in the intimate company, and seemingly the parent, of a multitude of magical superstitions, if there was nothing in the religion itself to give rise to such a charge. The Gnostic family suitably traces its origin to a mixed race, which had commenced its national history by associating Orientalism with revelation. After the captivity of the 10 tribes, Samaria was colonized by men from Babylon and Cushan, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, who were instructed at their own instance in the manner of the God of the land by one of the priests of the church of Jeroboam. The consequence was that they feared the Lord and served their own gods. Of this country was Simon, the reputed patriarch of the Gnostics, and he is introduced in the Acts of the Apostles as professing those magical powers which were so principal a characteristic of the Oriental mysteries. His heresy, though broken into a multitude of sects, was poured over the world with a Catholicity not inferior in its day to Christianity. St. Peter, who fell in with him originally in Samaria, seems to have encountered him again at Rome. At Rome, St. Polycarp met Marcion of Pontus, whose followers spread through Italy, Egypt, Syria, Arabia, and Persia. Valentinus preached his doctrines in Alexandria, Rome, and Cyprus, and we read of his disciples in Crete, Caesarea, Antioch, and other parts of the East. Bardesanes and his followers were found in Mesopotamia. The Carpocratians are spoken of at Alexandria, at Rome, and in Cephallenia. The Basilidians spread through the greater part of Egypt. The Ophites were apparently in Bithynia and Galatia. The Cainites or Caens in Africa, and the Marcosians in Gaul. To these must be added several sects, which, though not strictly of the Gnostic stock, are associated with them in date, character, and origin. The Ebionites of Palestine, the Cerinthians, who rose in some part of Asia Minor, the Ankretites and kindred sects who spread from Mesopotamia to Syria, to Cilicia and other provinces of Asia Minor, and thence to Rome, Gaul, Aquitaine, and Spain, and the Montanists, who, with a town in Phrygia for their metropolis, reached at length from Constantinople to Carthage. When the reader of Christian history comes to the 2nd century, says Dr. Burton, he finds that Gnosticism, under some form or other, was professed in every part of the then civilized world. He finds it divided into schools, as numerously and as zealously attended as any which Greece or Asia could boast in their happiest days. He meets with names totally unknown to him before, which excited as much sensation as those of Aristotle and Plato. He hears of volumes having been written in support of this new philosophy, not one of which has survived to our own day. Many of the founders of these sects had been Christians. Others were of Jewish parentage. Others were more or less connected in fact with the pagan rites to which their own bore so great a resemblance. Montanus seems even to have been a mutilated priest of Cybele. The followers of Prodicus professed to possess the secret books of Zoroaster, and the doctrine of dualism which so many of the sects held is to be traced to the same source. Basilides seems to have recognized Mithras as the supreme being or the prince of angels or the sun, if Mithras is equivalent to Abraxas, which was inscribed upon his amulets. On the other hand, he is said to have been taught by an immediate disciple of St. Peter, and Valentinus by an immediate disciple of St. Paul. Marcion was the son of a bishop of Pontus, Tatian, a disciple of St. Justin Martyr. Whatever might be the history of these sects, and though it may be a question whether they can be properly called superstitious, and though many of them numbered educated men among their teachers and followers, they closely resembled, at least in ritual and profession, the vagrant pagan mysteries which have been above described. Their very name of Gnostic implied the possession of a secret which was to be communicated to their disciples. Ceremonial observances were the preparation, and symbolical rites the instrument, of initiation. Tatian and Montanus, the representatives of very distinct schools, agreed in making asceticism a rule of life. The followers of each of these sectaries abstained from wine, the Tatianites and Marcionites from flesh. The Montanists kept 3 Lents in the year. All the Gnostic sects seem to have condemned marriage on one or other reason. The Marcionites had 3 baptisms or more. The Marcosians had 2 rites of what they called redemption. The latter of these was celebrated as a marriage, and the room adorned as a marriage chamber. A consecration to a priesthood then followed, with anointing. An extreme unction was another of their rites, and prayers for the dead one of their observances. Bardesanes and Harmonius were famous for the beauty of their chants. The prophecies of Montanus were delivered, like the oracles of the heathen, in a state of enthusiasm or ecstasy. To Epiphanes, the son of Carpocrates, who died at the age of 17, a temple was erected in the island of Cephallenia, his mother's birthplace, where he was celebrated with hymns and sacrifices. A similar honor was paid by the Carpocratians to Homer, Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, as well as to the apostles. Crowns were placed upon their images, and incense burned before them. In one of the inscriptions found at Cyrene, about 20 years since, Zoroaster, Pythagoras, Epicurus, and others are put together with our Lord as guides of conduct. These inscriptions also contain the Carpocratian tenet of a community of women. I am unwilling to allude to the agape and communions of certain of these sects, which were not surpassed in profligacy but by the pagan rites of which they were an imitation. The very name of Gnostic became an expression for the worst impurities, and no one dared eat bread with them or use their culinary instruments or plates. These profligate excesses are found in connection with the exercise of magic and astrology. The amulets of the Basilidians are still extant in great numbers, inscribed with symbols some Christian, some with figures of Isis, Serapis, and Anubis, represented according to the gross indecencies of the Egyptian mythology. St. Irenaeus had already connected together the two crimes in speaking of the Simonians. "Their mystical priests," he says, "live in lewdness and practice magic, according to the ability of each. They use exorcisms and incantations, love potions too, and seductive spells, the virtue of spirits and dreams, and all other curious arts they diligently observe." The Marcosians were especially devoted to these curious arts, which are also ascribed to Carpocrates and Apelles. Marcion and others were reported to have used astrology. Tertullian speaks generally of the sects of his day. "Infamous are the dealings of the heretics with sorcerers very many, with mountebanks, with astrologers, with philosophers, to wit, such as are given to curious questions. They everywhere remember, 'Seek and ye shall find.'" Such were the Gnostics, and to external and prejudiced spectators, whether philosophers, as Celsus and Porphyry, or the multitude, they wore an appearance sufficiently like the Church to be mistaken for her in the latter part of the ante-Nicene period, as she was confused with the pagan mysteries in the earlier. Of course, it may happen that the common estimate concerning a person or a body is purely accidental and unfounded, but in such cases it is not lasting. Such were the calumnies of child-eating and impurity in the Christian meetings, which were almost extinct by the time of Origen, and which might arise from the world's confusing them with the pagan and heretical rites. But when it continues from age to age, it is certainly an index of a fact, and corresponds to definite qualities in the object to which it relates. In that case, even mistakes carry information, for they are cognate to the truth, and we can allow for them. Often what seems like a mistake is merely the mode in which the informant conveys his testimony, or the impression which a fact makes on him. Censure is the natural tone of one man in a case where praise is the natural tone of another. The very same character or action inspires one mind with enthusiasm and another with contempt. What to one man is magnanimity, to another is romance, and pride to a third, and pretense to a fourth, while to a fifth it is simply unintelligible. And yet there is a certain analogy in their separate testimonies which conveys to us what the thing is like, and what it is not like. When a man's acknowledged note is superstition, we may be pretty sure we shall not find him an academic or an Epicurean. And even words which are ambiguous, as atheist or reformer, admit of a sure interpretation when we are informed of the speaker. In like manner, there is a certain general correspondence between magic and miracle, obstinacy and faith, insubordination and zeal for religion, sophistry and argumentative talent, craft and meekness, as is obvious. Let us proceed then in our contemplation of this reflection, as it may be called, of primitive Christianity in the mirror of the world. All three writers, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny, call it a superstition. This is no accidental imputation, but is repeated by a variety of subsequent writers and speakers. The charge of Thyestean banquets scarcely lasts 100 years. But while pagan witnesses are to be found, the Church is accused of superstition. The heathen disputant in Minucius calls Christianity vana et demens superstitio. The lawyer Modestinus speaks, with an apparent allusion to Christianity, of weak minds being terrified superstitione numinis. The heathen magistrate asks St. Marcellus whether he and others have put away vain superstitions and worship the gods whom the emperors worship. The pagans in Arnobius speak of Christianity as an execrable and unlucky religion, full of impiety and sacrilege, contaminating the rites instituted from of old with the superstition of its novelty. The anonymous opponent of Lactantius calls it impia et annihilis superstitio. Diocletian's inscription at Clunia was, as it declared, on occasion of the total extinction of the superstition of the Christians and the extension of the worship of the gods. Maximin, in his letter upon Constantine's edict, still calls it a superstition. Now, what is meant by the word thus attached by a consensus of heathen authorities to Christianity? At least it cannot mean a religion in which a man might think what he pleased, and was set free from all yokes, whether of ignorance, fear, authority, or priestcraft. When heathen writers call the Oriental rites superstitions, they evidently use the word in its modern sense. It cannot surely be doubted that they apply it in the same sense to Christianity. But Plutarch explains for us the word at length in his treatise which bears the name. Of all kinds of fear, he says, superstition is the most fatal to action and resource. He does not fear the sea who does not sail, nor war who does not serve, nor robbers who keeps at home, nor the sycophant who is poor, nor the envious if he is a private man, nor an earthquake if he lives in Gaul, nor thunder if he lives in Ethiopia. But he who fears the gods fears everything: earth, seas, air, sky, darkness, light, noises, silence, sleep. Slaves sleep and forget their masters. Of the fettered doth sleep lighten the chain. Inflamed wounds, ulcers cruel and agonizing, are not felt by the sleeping. Superstition alone has come to no terms with sleep, but in the very sleep of her victims, as though they were in the realms of the impious, she raises horrible spectres and monstrous phantoms and various pains, and whirls the miserable soul about and persecutes it. They rise, and instead of making light of what is unreal, they fall into the hands of quacks and conjurers, who say, "Call the crone to expiate, bathe in the sea, and sit all day on the ground." He goes on to speak of the introduction of uncouth names and barbarous terms into the divine and national authority of religion. Observes that whereas slaves, when they despair of freedom, may demand to be sold to another master, superstition admits of no change of gods, since the God cannot be found whom he will not fear, who fears the gods of his family and his birth, who shudders at the saving and benignant, who has a trembling and dread at those from whom we ask riches and wealth, concord, peace, success of all good words and deeds. He says, moreover, that while death is to all men an end of life, it is not so to the superstitious. For then there are deep gates of hell to yawn, and headlong streams of at once fire and gloom are opened, and darkness with its many phantoms encompasses, ghosts presenting horrid visages and wretched voices, and judges and executioners, and chasms and dens full of innumerable miseries. Presently he says that in misfortune or sickness the superstitious man refuses to see physician or philosopher, and cries, "Suffer me, O man, to undergo punishment. the impious, the cursed, the hated of gods and spirits. The atheist, with whom all along he is contrasting the superstitious disadvantageously, wipes his tears, trims his hair, doffs his mourning. But how can you address, how help the superstitious? He sits apart in sackcloth or filthy rags, and often he strips himself and rolls in the mud, and tells out his sins and offences, as having eaten and drunken something, or walked some way which the divinity did not allow, ... And in his best mood, and under the influence of a good-humoured superstition, he sits at home, with sacrifice and slaughter all around him, while the old crones hang on him as on a peg, as Bion says, any charm they fall in with. He continues, what men like best are festivals, banquets at the temples, initiations, orgies, votive prayers, and adorations. But the superstitious wishes indeed, but is unable to rejoice. He is crowned and turns pale. He sacrifices and is in fear. He prays with a quivering voice, and burns incense with trembling hands, and altogether belies the saying of Pythagoras that we are then in best case when we go to the gods. For superstitious men are in most wretched and evil case, approaching the houses or shrines of the gods as if they were the dens of bears, or the holes of snakes, or the caves of whales. Here we have a vivid picture of Plutarch's idea of the essence of superstition. It was the imagination of the existence of an unseen, ever-present master, the bondage of a rule of life, of a continual responsibility, obligation to attend to little things, the impossibility of escaping from duty, the inability to choose or change one's religion, an interference with the enjoyment of life, a melancholy view of the world, sense of sin, horror at guilt, apprehension of punishment, dread, self-abasement, depression, anxiety, and endeavor to be at peace with heaven, and error and absurdity in the methods chosen for the purpose. Such too had been the idea of the Epicurean Velleius, when he shrunk with horror from the sempiternus Dominus and curiosus Deus of the Stoics. Such, surely, was the meaning of Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny. And hence, of course, the frequent reproach cast on Christians as credulous, weak-minded, and poor-spirited. The heathen objectors in Minucius and Lactantius speak of their old woman's tales. Celsus accuses them of assenting at random and without reason, saying, "Do not inquire, but believe." They lay it down, he says elsewhere. Let no educated man approach, no man of wisdom, no man of sense. But if a man be unlearned, weak in intellect, an infant, let him come with confidence. Confessing that these are worthy of their God, they evidently desire, as they are able, to convert none but fools, and vulgar, and stupid, and slavish women and boys. They take in the simple, and lead him where they will. They address themselves to youths, house servants, and the weak in intellect. They hurry away from the educated as not fit subjects of their imposition, and inveigle the rustic. Thou, says the heathen magistrate to the martyr Fructuosus, who as a teacher dost disseminate a new fable, that fickle girls may desert the groves and abandon Jupiter, condemn, if thou art wise, the anile creed. Hence the epithets of itinerant, mountebank, conjurer, cheat, sophist, sorcerer, heaped upon the teachers of Christianity, sometimes to account for the report or apparent truth of their miracles, sometimes to explain their success. Our Lord was said to have learned his miraculous power in Egypt. Wizard, mediciner, cheat, rogue, conjurer were the epithets applied to him by the opponents of Eusebius. They "worship that crucified sophist," says Lucian. Paul, who surpasses all the conjurers and impostors who ever lived, is Julian's account of the apostle. "You have sent through the whole world," says St. Justin to Trypho, "to preach that a certain atheistic and lawless sect has sprung from one Jesus, a Galilean cheat." "We know," says Lucian, speaking of Chaldeans and magicians, "the Syrian from Palestine who is the sophist in these matters. How many lunatics with eyes distorted and mouth in foam he raises and sends away restored, ridding them from the evil at a great price." If any conjurer came to them, a man of skill and knowing how to manage matters, says the same writer, he made money in no time, with a broad grin at the simple fellows. The officer who had custody of St. Perpetua feared her escape from prison by magical incantations. When St. Tiburtius had walked barefoot on hot coals, his judge cried out that Christ had taught him magic. St. Anastasia was thrown into prison as a mediciner. The populace called out against St. Agnes, "Away with the witch! Tolle magam! Tolle maleficam!" When St. Bonosus and St. Maximilian bore the burning pitch without shrinking, Jews and Gentiles cried out, "Isti magi et maleficae!" "What new delusion," says the heathen magistrate concerning St. Romanus, "has brought in these sophists to deny the worship of the gods? How doth this chief sorcerer mock us, skilled by his Thessalian charm (carmine) to laugh at punishment!" Hence we gather the meaning of the word carmen as used by Pliny, when he speaks of the Christians saying with one another a carmen to Christ as to a god. He meant pretty much what Suetonius expresses by the malefica superstitio. And the words of the last mentioned writer and Tacitus are still more exactly, and I may say singularly, illustrated by clauses which occur in the Theodosian Code, which seem to show that these historians were using formal terms and phrases to express their notion of Christianity. For instance, Tacitus says, "Quos per flagitia invisos vulgus Christianos appellabat," and the law against the malefici and mathematici in the Code speaks of those "quos ob facinorum magnitudinem vulgus maleficos appellat." Again, Tacitus charges Christians with the odium humani generis. This is the very characteristic of a practicer in magic. The laws call the malefici humani generis hostes, humane generis inimici, naturae peregrini, communis salutis hostes. This also explains the phenomenon which has created so much surprise to certain moderns, that a grave, well-informed historian like Tacitus should apply to Christians what sounds like abuse. Yet what is the difficulty? Supposing that Christians were considered mathematici and magi, and these were the secret intriguers against established government, the allies of desperate politicians, the enemies of the established religion, the disseminators of lying rumors, the perpetrators of poisonings and other crimes. "Read this," says Paley, after quoting some of the most beautiful and subduing passages of St. Paul. "Read this, and then think of exitiabilis superstitio." And he goes on to express a wish, in contending with heathen authorities, to produce our books against theirs. As if it were a matter of books. Public men care very little for books. The finest sentiments, the most luminous philosophy, the deepest theology, inspiration itself, moves them but little. They look at facts, and care only for facts. The question was, what was the worth, what the tendency of the Christian body in the state? What Christians said, what they thought, was little to the purpose. They might exhort to peaceableness and passive obedience as strongly as words could speak. But what did they do? What was their political position? This is what statesmen thought of then, as they do now. What had men of the world to do with abstract proofs or first principles? A statesman measures parties and sects and writers by their bearing upon him. And he has a practised eye in this sort of judgment, and is not likely to be mistaken. "What is truth?" said jesting Pilate. Apologies, however eloquent or true, availed nothing with the Roman magistrate against the sure instinct which taught him to dread Christianity. It was a dangerous enemy to any power not built upon itself. He felt it, and the event justified his apprehension. End of Part 2 of Chapter 6.